order, and it's very nice to see such a full House. Can I welcome everyone, and particularly the Secretary of State and the Permanent Secretary, to the first oral formal evidence of the new Department of Work and Pensions Select Committee. We've got quite a full agenda in front of us today, so just a very brief welcome to you both, and thanks very much for giving up your time. And hopefully you'll find the committee, I was going to say friendly, but I'm not quite sure if that's quite what you want from the Select Committee. But certainly, you know, obviously part of our job is to make sure that the Department of Work and Pensions gets its decisions right, and we're part of the important role of scrutiny in this place. So thanks very much for coming along. Can I just begin, because there's obviously been quite a lot of questions over the weekend about departmental spend and things. And I know on one of the TV channels last night that you were denying that there had been a major bust-up between yourself and the Chancellor. But the way that these things work, I know that there will have been some robust discussions about the department budget. So can I ask the question, who won?
Well, actually, I think there's always a nature of robust discussions between the Treasury and various departments about the way to do things. I mean, the fact is that I come into government only a few months ago, and we recognise that we face a significant problem. We have to get the deficit down, so every department has to play their part in that, and we, of course, have the extra added issue of the scale of welfare spending. Not all of it, of course, is as big as you will know, is in my department, of course. It's often forgotten that some of these ones are within the Treasury themselves, or certainly at HMRC, of course, coming out of the Chancellor's own brief. So tax credits and child benefits, which are often asked of me, are, of course, the Chancellor's remit, not mine. So whilst I make suggestions to him, he, of course, makes the final decisions on those. But the rest of the benefits area is mine. And so I have to look at the departmental spend and figure out whether or not what we are spending is being effective, and could it be more effectively spent in different ways, and is there any scope to reduce the expenditure whilst at the same time improving outcomes. And the reality for us is that within that problem of the very large deficit, we also have a problem with a system which I believe, and I believe on both sides of the House, we recognise now has become so incredibly complicated that the very people it serves quite often are ill-served by it now, because that complication, particularly for people going back to work, means they're often unable to understand quite how well off, or if they will be better off, as they enter work. And there are, of course, issues, obviously, for people who have various disabilities to know quite what they should or should not be receiving. So there's a whole scope of issues. I must say, though, within that context, I myself did read some wonderfully exotic articles over the summer about these. A woman from a department with a wonderfully exotic name, and secret meetings and various other bits and pieces. I don't recognise all of that, to be fair. I'm sad that I don't, but nonetheless it made interesting reading and fun to read too. After all, we have to have something to look at in the summer. But my only advice to the committee is you shouldn't always believe everything that you read in the newspapers. I say that rather carefully, looking across to my right.
Well, perhaps in terms of what we read in the newspapers, you might be able to clarify the figures, because finding that quite confusing. The figure of 11 billion savings from your department has been bandied about and has been part of what was in the budget. And then over the weekend there have been 4 billion and then 2.5 billion. Are these additional?
Yeah.
What actually is the figure with regard to your own department?
Well, it really breaks into two parts. Those things which are public, which were in the budget, and I think the 11 billion figure that you refer to refers to that. And of course that you need to look at, and I'm sure that the committee will know, that is a cumulative figure looked at. So it doesn't come in any specific year, but it is a cumulative figure, and much of those figures are in the public domain and are as a result of various changes that were brought forward in the budget. Again, not all to do with my department. A large chunk of that is due.
What's the timescale for that? Is that with the period of the company?
Well, it's within the spending review still. And the point about this, we should see this in the round, because we're in the middle of the spending review right now. So any other figure that references the spending review, I obviously clearly can't confirm, because I'll be quite honest with the committee, we haven't reached any conclusions about this at all. Not at all. I can't even whisper something to the committee. And as regards figures like 4 billion, I simply don't recognise that figure at all. And I also let the committee know that I think I was away in Oslo on Sunday attending an ILO conference, with an IMF ILO conference. So I only picked up the story that was in the Sunday papers at the last moment, and I think it was referring to a letter. Well, first of all, I couldn't remember the letter. It took me ages to find out what that letter was, but that letter had nothing to do with our present discussions at all and should be disregarded. It was the view, if it exists at all, the view of an individual, but it didn't necessarily refer to anything. In fact, it doesn't refer to anything we're doing at the moment. So.
But there's no doubt that over the period of the comprehensive spending review, things are going to be very tight for your department, and you are one of the big spending departments in government. So, you know, the other thing was on Monday during the urgent question, the Chancellor was talking a lot about working age benefits, but actually incapacity benefits is only 13.6 billion only. It's a huge amount of money, but when you look at your own departmental budget, and the Chancellor was saying that a third of all government spending is on welfare, but well over half of that, almost two-thirds of that, actually goes to people of pension age, not people of working age. Yeah. So because of the concentration, a lot of the stuff that's come from your department being mostly about working age, are you not actually limiting your ability to make the kind of savings that you and the Chancellor want?
Well, we have to make savings. That is absolutely clear. But my view about this over the period of the spending review is we will better make savings by reforming the system, and that's the critical part of the whole of the area of discussions that we have, which is reform is the key way. I mean, I've witnessed too many governments come and go, Labour or Conservative, or coalition now, that have attempted to deal with the welfare bill by simply pressing down from the top, saying, well, we can just cut this. And I think the last government attempted to do that at the time, and each government has seen them, by and large, balloon back up again. So a lot of these savings end up being temporary savings and don't actually, and often aren't delivered. So my point about this is the reform is the key, that we have to make savings, I agree, and it's good that you remind everybody that pensions are a very significant part of the overall spend of the department, quite legitimately so. And we have a pensions reform programme and agenda, which no doubt you want to talk about later on, but that, of course, arguably has a bigger bearing on finances than anything we do on working age benefits. So I accept that, but yes, it isn't. No one said this process was easy, to beg, at all. I mean, you know, anybody sitting in my position today would much rather that they were sitting in the position 10 years ago where we had time and scope and money to make reforms, and I wish the last government had attempted that seriously and not left us with this mess.
You're right, we have got lots of questions about those reforms and things, but quite a number of them will actually initially cost more money. You know, in order to enact the reforms, it will cost money, which you would hope to then recover as savings further along the way. But and that, you know, that is not the basis of your discussions rather than arguments with the Treasury, because that means pump priming of some kind.
Well, as I said last night, you're referring to an interview I gave on Sky. As I said last night, you know, if our roles were reversed, I would be saying exactly the same things the Chancellor says to me, which is he wants me, quite rightly, to be able to demonstrate that our reforms that I propose work. I believe they do. I believe we can demonstrate that. And that they will ultimately improve the situation and thus both save money, but improve it in the sense that we have a better process of getting people back to work. And after all, at the end of it, when we look at our joint, everyone in this committee's commitment to ending child poverty by 2020, it is my strong view that we will not do that whilst Britain remains one of the worst countries in Europe for workless households and children born into workless households. We have a staggering number. Nearly 20% of all British households are workless. That is, not an adult works in them. And about 16 to 70% of all children born today are born into workless households. So, you know, the government has spent a lot of money, the last government, on eradicating child poverty and, to some degree, had some success. But what they found is they hit the buffers because the persistent problems with poverty lie in these workless households. So this reform the reforms I hope to be able to bring forward, will save money, I believe, because we will start to get at those households where there is persistent worklessness.
But the most recent figure suggests that there are more children living in poverty in households where there's someone in work than there are children living in poverty in workless households. So even getting people into work isn't going to solve some of that problem because of low wages, and so they still need the help from government in terms of housing benefit, council tax rebate and tax credits. So it's not an obvious complete saving of the whole welfare bill.
Well, of course, part of the reforms that I'm talking about, and I wasn't going to go into detail now because of your specific questions about these discussions, but the reality is that, of course, part of that process is to make work pay. That's critical, and that is your best way of eradicating child poverty.
Well, I'm sure my colleagues will come back on that. We've got some questions there exactly on the subject of your document 21st Century Welfare and the proposals for single working age benefit. Sajid Javid.
Yeah, good morning. The stakeholders have broadly welcomed the document 21st Century Welfare, but there is, I think it's fair to say, there's some concern about the timescale of delivery of some of the thoughts in here and the process for implementing the change. Can we just ask, what are your plans for taking the consultation, once the consultation closes, taking this forward? Do you plan to produce a white paper or a draft bill, or do you think it will go straight to a final bill at the start of the new year?
No, the plan is that we will complete this early consultation, and we've had a lot of submissions from politicians as well as from think tanks, from the media too. They won't actually make official submissions, but they certainly make commentary. So a number of groups, different groups, as well as various poverty groups, etc., have made responses to it. We've talked to the trade unions. We've had a pretty wide consultation. That will be reflected in the next phase, which is to go to a white paper in the autumn, which will bring together those consultations and flesh out a bit more of the detail about how we intend to implement this. To be fair, this document you've got in front of you is some way behind where we are in the department. And I want to say something early on, by the way, about this, if I could use this opportunity. I beg to say that the department has been excellent, really, since I arrived. I think the way they've grabbed this issue and run with it, and I am full of praise for their focus. Quite often civil servants get blamed at the moment and attacked, and I want to put it on record, if I can, that I think the department's officials have been second to none in their determination to make some of these reforms work. And to that extent, they're working very hard at the moment on the white paper.
Richard.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Secretary of State. Just looking, and I appreciate what you said, that the outline approach in the 21st Century Welfare document is some way behind where you all are in the department in working up different options and so on. But one of the most striking things of the meetings that we've had so far is that everybody really buys into the direction of the journey that the department wants to go on. But within this document, obviously there's very little that sheds much light on the different costs of the options that you're looking at. Is it possible to share with us today some of the different costs likely to be involved in looking at things like universal credit and the single unified taper, and what sort of estimates you've therefore submitted to the Treasury in terms of what this is likely to cost, especially at the beginning of the programme, where the cost will be up front and the benefits, the savings, are likely to come through later?
Well, I can't specify today the cost because, to be fair, as we work through this and making some advances in the modelling, and the modelling is really quite extensive now, we're finding by and large that the original estimates of costs are falling. One of the things it's doing for us quite well is understand the nature of who isn't claiming benefits and why in a way that has been very poor up until now. In fact, a byproduct of it is to understand these groups far better. And as we understand them far better, we understand some of their rationale for why they've not been claiming, and that's becoming much clearer to us, and that will become clearer in the white paper. So the cost issues, if you don't mind, I will slightly bypass, because a lot of the figures being bandied around in the media, by the way, are by and large incorrect. Some of them are based on the original Centre for Social Justice paper. That of itself, things have moved on some distance from there, and we're much clearer now about take-up rates and things like that, and that's becoming clearer all the time. So if I was to put a figure out now, the chances are that within a month or two that will be wrong. And rather than putting out wrong figures, forgive me, I'll wait till the white paper before I can give you a proper set and a proper analysis. But our general, absolute clear belief is that what this system will do, most certainly, is to save money in one area, which is to do with the overpayments and the fraud, particularly in the tax credit area, which is, has been bad and poor since the tax credits were brought in, whereas DWP has borne down on its fraud area. There's still work to be done, and we're going to, as you saw in the budget, maximise our efforts in that area. We're going to bring in some more fraud inspectors, etc., and we believe we can make a better fist of that. We know that the tax credit area has always struggled, and the HMRC would be the first to tell you that. So we think that this system coming together like this will actually have a major bearing on that wasted money, which could be better spent and cost an awful lot to manage.
But in general, of the areas where the department is hoping to generate the 4.7 billion savings that you've said you will achieve by 2014-15, presumably if you've arrived at that figure, there is some breakdown between what you hope to save from reducing fraud, what you hope to gain by simplifying the system, and what you hope to gain from reducing the numbers of people, for example, on incapacity benefit. So there must be some form of breakdown of the savings areas from which you hope to generate them.
Yeah, of course, there are two areas. First of all, I have made no commitment to savings in the spending round yet, because that's a matter of discussion between myself, Treasury, and Downing Street generally. So I don't accept any particular figures in the run to October, for obvious reasons, October the 20th, that these matters are being decided. Of course, the universal credit idea, plus any of the others, is part of that mix, because, of course, it will start, and the idea will be brought in within the timescale of the review. Whether it's all within that timescale or not is a matter, as I say, for further discussion, and will be subject of the white papers. And that's why it's very difficult to say at this point specifically to what degree it will have a bearing or not on those spending figures, or not those figures, but figures that we will eventually arrive at.
So how did the figure of the 4.7 billion, which I think was in the department's briefing, how was that arrived at?
Well, I'm talking about the overall inclusive budget and spending review figures, which will become clear on the 20th. Right. So the universal credit will have a bearing on that overall figure. Yeah. So not hanging on to 4.7 billion, but the reality of what we say going ahead over the whole spending review will be the department's budget. So probably better to wait for that point, and then we can get a much clearer sight of how that works.
And the CSR comes before the white paper, does it?
Yeah, yes, yeah, absolutely. The white paper will be in the autumn, but for obvious reasons it's better to come after the spending review, because then you're dealing with facts rather than a negotiation, as it were.
So to what extent will the recommendations in the white paper alter according to the amount of money that's made available in the CSR? I mean, for example, is there a department plan A in terms of what you would do on single unified tapers if the results from the Treasury is X, and if you get rather less money, then there is a plan B which has a different approach to the taper?
No, there's only one plan, which is after discussion and analysis of the various options, we will agree which is the best option, and that, of course, will be it will also be agreed as to whether that has any costs. It may or may not, and if it does, what those are and how that will be funded, and then we'll take that forward. There will be no point in leaving options out there. What will come forward in the white paper will be our preferred position on this, and the figures around that will be quite clear.
And there isn't a particular option at the moment which the department has already modelled, which shows that it's easier to access, simpler to administer, and likely to produce better results over the next period, which you would advocate?
Well, I can only ever personally go back to the position that I originally took, which I think the universal credit is the best way forward, but we are dependent on the consultation and the discussions with others. So Universal credit was the thing that I came to the department with, essentially.
Yeah.
The department's worked hugely on, but there are these other options there, and those have to be, and we are looking at them all and proving them or disproving them, as the case may be.
What will be the impact if the universal credit were to go ahead? What will be the impact in terms of IT systems that will need to be developed by the department?
Right.
How confident would the department be that there could be an IT system robust enough to actually make that work, bearing in mind all the various other IT hazards we've seen over the years?
Actually, this department, historically, under the last government as well, has got a pretty good record about managing and installing IT systems. Of all the departments out there, I'd say to my permanent secretary, who I'm sure would be happy to take you through some of their success stories, if you wish us to do that. But the reality is the department is accepted in the Treasury, HMRC and everywhere else as being probably the best department for implementing IT programs. The second thing is that I don't believe that there is a necessity for a major IT program associated with this. I explained to you today about that because that will become clear when we do the white paper, but should we go to the universal credit, I believe it is a middling sort of IT change that is required, some of which is already anticipated both in the HMRC and in the department before I arrive, not on the basis of this, but in further changes that will be made. For example, the discussions you've heard about changes to PAYE and various others, these all become part of the same. So I don't think it's on the sort of grand collapse scale that we've seen in the past, far from it. It's well below that. And given the history and the nature of the department in handling that sort of scale, what we call sort of medium size, and probably less, actually, lower IT projects, I have huge confidence that we'd be able to get this done. There wouldn't be a lot of risk. In fact, there's very little risk attached to it.
And all the costs of that are already built into budget proposals?
They would, absolutely, by the time the white paper comes forward, they will be clear and built into that.
Well, we won't mention the CSA and computer as well, though I have to say pension service was actually very good. I'm going to bring in Karen and Sajid very quickly, and then Harriet.
Secretary of State, if I understood you rightly, you were implying that the main savings you'd expect from universal credit would come from fraud and overpayments in the current tax credit system.
No, I didn't say main. I said an illustrative area of saving that we believe will come from this change will be in that area, which has been very difficult to control over the last 10 years.
Have you reached an agreement then with the Treasury that any savings that you'd make that would be made from fraud and overpayments in tax credits would be counted against savings in the DWP budget?
We're discussing all of that right now.
That's the robust discussion. Sajid.
Well, actually, my question, Secretary, was just really pretty much on the same lines, that there's you clearly, if these proposals are implemented, more people you're going to work, less state dependency, there will be savings across government in many departments, not just with what my colleague Karen mentioned, but maybe in the health department, for example, and education and so forth. Is there a general recognition of that within government amongst your colleagues that really your department can generate savings for them all? And in that case, is there a less of a silo approach in looking at that?
Well, these are discussions and debates that have to be held within departments. It has to be said that these sort of savings are always divided into hard and soft savings. Hard savings are the ones that you can recognise within the timescale of a spending review. Are tangible, such as fraud, error, getting people back to work, taking people off benefit. Those are very clear savings that are likely to be made in the course of what I call hard savings. The savings that I believe also come directly as a result, and I think are accepted across the piece now amongst think tanks and others who look at this, is that there are other connections too. One of the points that we've always made is if you want to know where some of the greatest call on the health service is, go to the areas of highest unemployment with lower life expectancy and problems there, and you'll see the connection between workless households and health problems, depression and things like that. So we believe that, as I believe this system would be, more effective in getting people back to work, maintaining them work, allowing work essentially to be clear that it pays and that it does pay. I am pretty certain that that will have an effect in the longer term on things like health problems and various other issues around. So I'm not, however, advancing that right now here. I'm simply saying in the shorter term, we believe this system would be better at affecting the benefit system by getting people back to work and by improving the way the system works right now, which almost every official in the department has told me they believe is close to being broken. It's really difficult to maintain. In fact, I wonder if I might just ask the Permanent Secretary to relate one story that we do this back to the floor where officials go to the job centres and work for a week. And the Permanent Secretary came back with one a week or two ago, which I just wondered, could I ask him to relate that? Right, just it's illustrative of what the problems are here.
It was really interesting. I was at a job centre in East Anglia and sitting alongside a lone parent advisor. And she met and talked to one of her customers who knew her well and had come in to ask for advice. And this was a very experienced member of staff. This wasn't a new member of staff having to kind of work it all out on day one. And the circumstances were quite interesting. This was a single parent with 4 children, I think from somewhere around sort of the ages of 6 up to about 12. And one of the children was disabled, and she was a carer, of course, for all the children, but especially for that child. Her question was a very simple one, actually. She was already doing some part-time work as a school dinner lady in the school that 2 of her children went to. And the school had asked her to up her hours, to increase her hours at the start of the new term. And her question very simply to the advisor was, will I be better off? If I do that and get this money, what will happen to my benefits? Will I end up better off? It took the advisor 3/4 of an hour, even with the technology that they've got on their desktop to go through better off in work calculations. It took the advisor 3/4 of an hour to arrive at the conclusion, and the conclusion that she would be better off. But it was immensely complicated, and it just brought home to me, kind of just how complex this system has become.
Harriet.
Thank you. The paper outlines the 2 major problems that you're focusing on at the moment, the complexity and the work incentives. And one other aspect of the system that is often mentioned as a problem is the fact that it creates disincentives for couples to bring up children together. And I just wondered whether the proposals, which of the proposals you think would have an impact on that?
Well, it's always difficult to project forward and in that area about people bringing up children together or apart, etc. But I think that there's accepted now, I think Frank Field was the first to raise this, that there is a problem within the benefit system in the sense that because of the focus, and some of them say legitimate focus on trying to eradicate child poverty by focusing on lone parents who were in the worst situation, that's accepted. The byproduct of that, not intended I'm sure, but the byproduct of that is that there has become a differential on benefits between couples bringing up children and lone parents bringing up children, and trying to eradicate that without damaging the work that's been done on lone parents I think is important. I think the system, as people go back into work, would help that. I think it would help eradicate that by essentially making work pay for whatever relationship was bringing up those children, and I think that would help it. What does that mean? Well, that simply means that people will make the choices that they make. It's not the job of the government to go dictating to them in any way at all, but providing the government doesn't skew that process in one direction, then my general view about this is that people will make those decisions in the most positive way they can for the raising of their children. And certainly, obviously, being together will take slightly less pressure, more pressure off the lone parent, but that's a decision that they will have to make on balance of their situation.
So will an outcome of these potential changes be that you will no longer feel that you're better off apart?
I think the best way to answer the question is, will it go towards re-stabilising and equalising that process? I think it gives us the opportunity to do that. How far we wish to go on that is dependent on finances and discussions within government. But the bringing together and creating of the single benefit allows you to manage that in an easier way while sustaining your support for those who genuinely need it.
Thank you. Kate, very quickly.
Yes, I just wanted to follow that line of thought a little further, because I think the evidence is that in terms of material deprivation, single-parent families still suffer more. And so I was reassured, I think I heard you say, Secretary of State, that it wasn't about skewing the system one way or another. In terms of your thinking about supporting couples to bring up children together, are you particularly thinking about that in situations where couples may not have both members of the partnership working? Is that a priority for you? Or are you looking at some sort of evening out of the premium for hours worked for couples?
Well, this particular reform is aimed at the process of taking people from where they are through to work. So work is critical within that process. So obviously making work pay for lone parent or couples is quite critical for the household. One thing about the universal credit, which is why this makes it slightly easier if we were to go down that, I'd say the if, obviously, because that's a matter still of discussion, is that the universal credit allows us to look at household income in the way that the present system does not, so that we can understand better what is happening within a household rather than just focus on an individual. And that allows us, therefore, to understand in the totality of what's going on in that household, who's working, who's not working, and what effect that has on their income. And so it will allow us to understand better, I think, what is happening to households that are out of work and to what degree that income, or lack of income, but income through benefits, affects their lives. So I think that the idea of the universal credit allows us to understand that better. With the moment, the tendency is to make assumptions, that there is no other income coming into a family. Sometimes there is, that household income works, and in other cases there's not, and that income is too low. So the universal credit, I think, will allow us to analyse what's going on in a household far better than we do at the moment. I think it'll have a positive effect, that's what I'm saying. Both for lone parents and couples.
Did you want to come back, Larry? No. Stephen Lloyd.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary of State. As you've already alluded to a number of times on the universal credit and the single payment system, I'm sure you'll be unsurprised to learn that we've had representation from a number of different groups representing people who are in a disadvantaged situation, and though broadly they can see the advantages of a single payment system, there are elements of concern that it won't be flexible enough to actually cope with some of the chaotic and very changeable situations that do apply to people in that position. Are you confident yourself, if we do actually end up with the universal payment system, that it will be able to cope with that potentially chaotic group?
What I'm confident of right now is the present system does not. It's one of its biggest problems. The reason why HMRC and others have this terrible level of overpayments is because in attempting to forecast a stable period for somebody, we find people on low incomes will often rotate in and out of work. They have difficulties, have problems, particularly their parents get into difficulties. The present system is set up so that there is a constancy over a period of year and assumes that. Therefore, that's why when you pay something, you're constantly trying to get money back from people. And that's also not fair, because once you've paid somebody money, trying to get it back off people on low incomes is both difficult and becomes quite oppressive. And you can recognise why that we have to try and get the money back. But it doesn't make life easy, because as you know, people on low incomes, when you pay them money like this, they tend to spend it. You could argue that's the biggest form of money going into the economy, because it's spent almost immediately for obvious reasons, because it's enough to live, it's not enough to save. What I believe the present system will do in two areas, which is to try and create a real-time system, will allow us, therefore, to stop this process of trying to forecast over a long period, but to understand in reality what is happening, say, over a period of 1 month, which will allow us actually to pay a figure of money to somebody for that month, as it were, knowing that the next month things may have changed, and so that figure may change as well. And that, I think, will hugely improve the quality of life for people on low incomes, because, for once, the nature of often quite, as you pointed out, fractured processes in their lives, we'll be able to track it, understand it better, and that will also allow us to work something else which we haven't talked about yet, which is the work programme. The new work programme, unified work programme, we're bringing in, with its very tailored concept of support and help, which it has to be. The two would go very well together, because now we'll understand financially what's happening to somebody. That allows us also, the job centres, to spot this and get people into the work programme at the key moments, knowing what's happening to their lives through that finance, rather than waiting for long periods until we figure out that actually some family is in difficulty. So I think the two would come together and actually be a positive reform, particularly for people on low income. And it has to be said, I think that they are the people who will be most positively affected by this.
I would agree. To make that work, though, we're back to the IT in the sense that you've already mentioned or alluded to the fact that you're reasonably confident that the level and complexity of the IT needs for this would be manageable. I also do accept that in many ways the DWP have actually handled IT fairly well over the last 20 years compared to the tax authorities. But from, like everyone else around the table, I've had numerous casework from numerous constituents in this area, and it really can vary, or their circumstances can change literally within a couple of weeks, and that change can be catastrophic because individual or families in that situation are right on the edge. So I just really want to seek further confirmation that, in your view, in the department's view, this level of IT, as far as you're concerned, is very manageable.
I can only give you my view, and the view, I'll ask the Permanent Secretary to tell you what he thinks from an official standpoint. It might help you a bit better. But my view about this process is that I wouldn't engage on it if I felt in any way that it wouldn't. The key thing, as I keep coming back to, is right now the present system is appallingly bad at helping people who have these very changeable arrangements in their lives. I mean, you know, someone goes into work for a month or two and it doesn't work out, they crash out for a while, they have trouble getting their housing benefit back. We know what goes on. I mean, we've all had the endless stream of people coming in saying, you know, actually going to work is a process that makes you worse off if it goes wrong, so I never want to do it again. That is what stands between people then trying one more time. It also means that their income falls actually before coming back up. So the system itself right now has a major problem in the sense that for the very worst off it often can affect them rather badly. So changing this, I believe, coming to a real-time process will allow us to radically change that process. And I believe, therefore, that the system is manageable, but I also, therefore, believe the principle of the system actually allows us to focus in on those very changeable processes in somebody's lives who is at the bottom end of the income scale trying to get into work. I think particularly in this case as well, lone parents. I think they're one of the groups that often finds it difficult to sustain work for reasons to do with care responsibilities, and we'll understand that far better.
Well, I certainly wish you every success for that, because I'm like you, I actually share a complete conviction that that approach is probably the only way that we can move forward with this. Where I'm a little more anxious, perhaps, is whether the IT can cope.
Perhaps I could ask Permanent Secretary, just to, I mean, rather than hear from me, I'm a politician.
Well, simply to say no Permanent Secretary, I don't think ever would regard significant IT change lightly, because with any IT change, there is always a degree of risk. That's in the nature of the IT business. But we do have a strong record in the department of introducing major IT change. For example, the introduction of the Employment and Support Allowance required a massive IT re-engineering in the department, which went successfully. And as the Secretary of State has said, the IT changes, if we move to a universal credit system, are significantly smaller in scale and complexity than that. And we do have now in a way that my department, and I don't think any part of Whitehall had a decade ago, we have some very, very professional IT specialists, both inside the department and in our supplier community. So you never take these things lightly. You never say there is no risk. You plan, you check, you test, you probe. But we have got a very strong IT record, and we do believe this is absolutely doable.
Well, I certainly wish you good fortune with that, Permanent Secretary. Another issue that, again, is something that affects my post considerably since the coalition government was put together, and I'm sure all my colleagues around the table, and that is there are always going to be a number of people, including vulnerable groups such as disabled people, who may never be able to work. How can you ensure that they are not disadvantaged under a system which focuses inevitably on incentivising people to work, and can you guarantee that they will continue to receive benefits at an adequate level in the long term?
I think the simple answer to that is, I believe, yes. And the reason for that is the way in which we remain committed to the process of support for the disabled, DLA and others, and I'm sure we'll come to that later on in the processes today. But also the way in which the work capability assessment that we're shaping up at the moment and the employment support allowance as shaped, as inherited from the last government, but the way we're looking at that, I think will ensure that, because, of course, rather than simply writing off people onto incapacity benefit and then never seeing them, which, of course, was hugely the case in the past, people just didn't get seen. I think something like nearly 50% of those on incapacity benefit hadn't seen or been asked to be seen by anybody for over 6 years. And many of them could have been helped by those sort of interviews. So moving people onto ESA, Employment Support Allowance, knowing that it has these two particular categories, that of support and that of work-related groups. Support group obviously will have to have strong support because they're not capable of work, will not be deemed capable of work, but need to be supported and helped. And then the other group, of course, which is the work-related group, which it's believed might be able to do some work. Some of them may be transitory, people, for example, undergoing chemotherapy or whatever, and they may be seen later on as being able to go to job seekers allowance. It gives us the flexibility with employment support allowance of defining people properly and moving with them as their circumstances change, which is important, I think, even in our general reviews. So it is a commitment of ours. I think the Chancellor made it again the other day when he was in the House, but certainly a commitment I'd back up that what we want to be able to do is those who have the greatest difficulty, we should support them in the greatest way that we possibly can, because these choices are not open to them. So whilst we are after getting people into work, we're not after getting people into work who generally cannot work, and that is a matter that will be defined endlessly and constantly as we review the process.
And presumably a core part of the Department's thinking then will be factoring in the additional living costs of disabled people who is then still going to have to be met from the universal credit system.
Well, the realities like DLA, they will continue. There's not going to be a change to that, in the sense that DLA is not an employment-related support. DLA is a lifestyle-related support. It's because people both in work and out of work need that support to be able to conduct their lives. That's accepted, I think, by every politician. I think it's an excellent concept, and it deals with those particular areas. So that is accepted. So it's not, that isn't a part of that process insofar as this is about getting people, universal credit or one of the other.
So that would include things, Secretary of State, like access to work. That would be something that...
Yes, all of that stuff, of course, must be reflected in the nature of what we're trying to reform.
Right, okay, thank you.
Margaret, very briefly.
Just ask, are you required to undertake an equality impact assessment for these proposals, and are you going to do that?
I couldn't hear you, sorry.
Sorry, are you required to undertake an equality impact assessment as part of these proposals?
Yes.
And if so, will it be published at the time of the white paper?
We certainly are, yes. I'll have to have a discussion with to see how far advanced we are in it, but at some point it certainly will be published, whether it's published right at the time or will come out during the process of the white paper. But if you'll forgive me if I can come back and answer that directly.
Okay. We move on to questions on labour market and work incentives. Over here.
On the face of it, it's quite encouraging. We've got 184,000 more people in work in the last quarter, the best result for 20 years. The Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development say that in the South East, the East, the Midlands and London, very strong recruitment intentions by personnel directors. So are you satisfied that there will be plenty of jobs for people to go to as you try to move people from the the incapacity benefit and from long-term worklessness into work?
Well, Zil, I have to tell you, I'll give you a heads up on the figures that were published at 9:30 this morning. You may not have seen them yet, but they're actually quite interesting. So perhaps I could start the answer to this by reading out some of the figures, which I think are quite fascinating. The figures for the last quarter show that employment has risen by 286,000, which is, I think, the largest rise since 1989. So this morning's figures are really quite startling. Unemployment is down by about 8,000 in the latest figures. But what is interesting is the claimant count is up by about 2,300. So, the vacancies is around about 470,000. Gone down a tiny amount, but it's give or take, within that area that it was when you last looked at these figures. So, in essence, what is going on here right now is it's a sign that there are still, even at the time of coming out of recession, at the beginnings of this, there's still a number of jobs available. To be borne in mind, those are advertised vacancies at the job centre over the period. It, of course, doesn't take into account the jobs that were advertised and have been taken, nor does it take into consideration the fact that there are plenty of jobs out there that are not advertised with a job centre and are informally advertised and taken up without any involvement of the job centre. So I think, whilst I'm not saying this is a great situation to be in, my general view is that this is at least a reasonable position to be in. What I do say is that the number of people going back into work is surprising, in the sense it's the largest since 1989. And we think that's hugely to do with a lot of younger people, students, etc., now moving into work directly. Predominantly, it's not, by the way, women. I mean, immediately people might think that this is a lot of women as second earners in households moving in, but no, the majority is actually men, and we think, therefore, it's a lot of people that weren't originally on that charge. We think, therefore, that the situation, whilst not being brilliant, is moving in the right direction. I think that there are jobs available, and I believe that the private sector will provide those jobs. As you recall, the forecast from the Office of Budget Responsibility was, including any forecast shakeout in the public sector, that there would be a net increase of jobs in the private sector, thus leading to lower levels of unemployment. So my answer to that question is, I think, my view is that that is the case, that those jobs will be created.
Now, you've visited more than any person coming into office as a Secretary of State, I would imagine, disadvantaged areas. In fact, you even persuaded me to go and work in a homeless hostel for a week up north. But do you accept that there is a problem that many of the people that you're trying to help are in parts of the country where the labour market is traditionally quite difficult, areas where governments, successive governments, have moved public sector jobs into those areas in order to provide some employment? And as we come to the necessary reductions in the public sector, are you going to face a problem in providing the jobs in those areas?
Well, I don't think it will be it's not my responsibility to provide the jobs in the specific areas or provide the jobs. I don't create jobs. The private sector will create the jobs. The public sector clearly does provide jobs, etc., but by and large the growth we forecast and the OVR's forecast is that the private sector will create those jobs. So the key question is, why would they create jobs in these areas? Actually, when I was looking down the vacancies last night, what I was interested in was that even now the spread of vacancies from the job centres is pretty even. Slight small change between, say, the North East and other parts, but by and large they are pretty much the same, that those jobs that I referred to, those 470,000 jobs or so, are spread pretty evenly around most of the regions. So those vacancies are there, and my anticipation is, by and large, as more jobs are created, those vacancies will be spread in much the same way. One of the key problems in this is to make sure, and this is what the work programme is all about, my responsibility is to make sure that as far as possible my department can help people be ready for work, ready to take that work, and then ensure that they do take that work. What's happened too much in the past is that people have been written off and forgotten about and left on the side. And I think the important thing about the work programme will help with this is that in areas that have traditionally had difficulty, the work programme, with its very tailored support, should be able to help get people through their problems. It can be literacy, it can be drugs, alcohol abuse. The beauty of this sort of black box programming of the work programme, which allows these private and voluntary sector organisations to do whatever is necessary to get somebody ready for work. That's the key bit. Too often in some of these areas, people have been out of work for a long time, they've lost confidence, they've lost courage, they've lost any sense of self-worth. What the work programme, I hope, will do will be to tackle that and start to bring them back to the workforce, and thus we'll be able to make sure that those areas see their employment levels rise, which I anticipate.
I mean, one of the concerns about the vacancies has been, and this is a long-standing problem, that many of them are in areas where the skills are not readily available in the workforce, and so you have jobs which are hard to actually place because the skills just aren't there. Are you working closely with our BIS team and others to ensure that the workforce, potential workforce, has the skills for the jobs that are out there and which the companies want done?
The answer to that is we are, but I'm always a little bit sceptical about this. There's also a tendency of people to say that the problem is the jobs that are coming up are mostly skilled jobs and people don't have the skills. Actually, they're pretty evenly spread. And my view, I think, when I look at the job centres, is that these jobs, there are less skilled jobs available in those job centres as well. And quite often it's been difficult to get people to come and take those jobs. It's been our bigger problem, not necessarily so much training them up for this. And what's interesting about this is that, and I know this is anecdotal, but we're human beings and anecdotes sometimes work. The reality is I did an interview last night in Sky, and the reason I did it was because it was follow-up to a programme that Sky had done on Merthyr Tydfil. And it was quite an interesting programme where they were talking to two employers in that area who had both said that they were ready to employ people from the local area in their businesses. One was an open-cast coal mine where he was actually bringing forward programmes to develop young people into the business, and they just couldn't get people to come and apply for those jobs. In the end, they cancelled the programmes. Now, I'm not saying that proves anything particularly, but it does suggest to me that one of the problems we've had, and this again I come back to the work programme, is if we get this right, and I believe we will, the work programme allows us to ensure that people are ready. And by ready I mean sometimes, as I said earlier on, personal issues and problems can stop them, you know, a lack of the right culture to go into work. And some of these kids are growing up in households where no one's had work for a generation or two generations. So you can understand culturally, why would you work? Nobody else works around you. You have no work support. So dealing with that's critical, and the work programme should be able to do that. And the second part, I think, is very important that the work programme must be able to do, which is to get people, as it were, tidied up, ready to take work. Sometimes particularly young people, will go to interviews without any sense of what's expected of them, and therefore do not respond well, and employers won't take them. So getting that sorted is arguably the most important feature. Generally, serious detailed training should happen once in work for jobs, and there I think government has a role to try and encourage and support industry to get that done quickly, so that then their training takes them through into work. Whilst you can train people for specifics outside of work, too often what's happened in the past is people have, organisations have trained people in one area to be specifically carpenters or whatever it happens to be, only to find actually subsequently there are no job vacancies or anything that really needs that skill, and so they're back to square one and their expectations were raised but they can't find it. So the key thing is making people job ready is an important process that the work programme will do. So my sense of this, the work programme we're doing is tied directly to the changes to the benefit system. Those two together will make it work. One without the other will make it more difficult.
I mean, one of the problems is that traditionally employers have been rather reluctant to employ people who've been off work for a long period of time. Is there any work that you're doing or any reassurance you can give that somehow it will be possible to persuade employers to take somebody who's been out of work for a long time or who's had a disability? Because it is a cultural change that's needed, isn't it?
It is, and employers have to, I believe, ante up to this as well. I was in the private sector. I know what you go through your head when you see somebody that's not been employed for a while and you question whether they're going to be as focused in work. And that, I think, again, is where the combination of the job centres picking the right people, the work programme cutting in for the longer term, and that's the point about the work programme, it picks up the people, by and large, beyond a year unemployed, and then can assure the businesses that what they're seeing in front of them is now the product of serious, detailed work to help that individual get back their self-confidence and their purpose and their focus. And that's the key, that we should be able to reassure those businesses and talk to them. And after all, the deliverers of this, and I'm sure you want to ask more questions about this later on, but the deliverers will themselves be private sector and voluntary sector organisations. And if we use, as I really expect we will, community and voluntary sector groups in the local areas to deliver a lot of this, they themselves know the businesses in those local areas. And I would expect them to be able to say to businesses, yes, this individual's been unemployed for a while, but I can promise you, the work we've done has restored their sense of themselves, their faith and their confidence, and you will get a very good deal if you take this individual on. So the reassurance at a local level is what's critical, rather than from a Whitehall-based individual. Permanent Secretary, do you want to say something on that?
Yes. Could I just add one thing, which is that perhaps a slightly sort of less known, less well known than it ought to be, programme which is already on offer, can support both job centres and private and third sector providers, and has been there for many years under successive administrations, is the work trial programme, under which an employer can take on someone who is unemployed for a period of some weeks without any obligation on the part of the employer or the individual. And that gives the employer a kind of risk-free period. And actually, it has it's got very high success rates in terms of the proportion of people who start on that programme who then are hired by the employer.
Which will remain as part of it.
Oh, good. Well, that's a very good scheme. Yeah. Just finally, on barriers to achieving your aims. I mean, one of the things that's been suggested is that if we were to change the arrangements about security of tenure in local or public sector housing, that might be a perverse incentive, that people who were on benefits might not want to get into work and get off benefits because it might put their house at risk in some way. Are you able to give any assurance on that point?
Yes, I know this is because I sort of initiated a little bit of this debate a few months ago. I didn't necessarily plan to initiate it, but nonetheless I did recognise that. But it's only because in the time that I was at the Centre for Social Justice, and we set that up, and we did a lot of work and went around many of the different communities, one of the it became quite obvious to us is that the UK, quite unique, but it's close to being unique, has this incredibly large number of workless households. As a proportion of all households, I said close on 20%, pretty significant really. So, and one of the issues and problems that you do when you talk to people in those areas is that those, often in estates, those estates were set up in areas where there used to be a lot of work. I mean, in my own area down in my area, the other side of Barking, you find the Lee Valley was a thriving area of manufacture, a lot of innovation. The light bulb, was basically invented there, and huge, tremendous aircraft industry. Ford was up there doing a lot of manufacture, and then there was legitimately secondary manufacture that followed on from big manufacturing plants. Where people doing die casting with 20 or 30 people in a small factory. A lot of that over the years has gone as more and more of that manufacturing has moved out or gone abroad, etc. So the problem for many people living in an area like that is that the jobs that their grandparents used to do are no longer available to them in that sense. And whilst other works come in, this comes back to the training point, they may not be necessarily ready for that. The second thing is there may be jobs elsewhere that would require them to travel some distance to work, and they're put off because they think that the amount of money they get going into work doesn't cover the travel to work costs, so that's an issue. And the second area is that where they find that there's areas where they may have some skills and they could meet those even further afield they might like to move to, and they'll often say, but why would I take that chance, because my family and I have got a house here. I can't do anything about that. And I know that the DCLG is looking at all of this to figure out how we can help and assist people who may want to do that. I don't say everybody will, but I say that the problem at the moment is, because of the way we run all these things, they run together. They mean that people often find themselves locked in against their own interest into areas where they might want to be more flexible about moving. Clearly, obviously, it's important for us to try and get work into those areas at the same time. But to give people the sort of choice that people on higher incomes have is critical. I mean, people further up the income scale think nothing sometimes of moving to different areas because, of course, their housing is portable. They can use their either rent some other place or sell a house or rent it out or whatever. So they're not locked to an area, which allows them to move, to adjust their income, to change their job prospects. We need to think more laterally about trying to find ways of doing that for others.
I mean, I'm not supposed to ask another question, but you've encouraged me, because, I mean, one of the things that does seem daft about our country is that you have something like the creative industries where, it's doing very well and it's expanding, and yet there are skill shortages for the technical backup jobs. which are needed in that industry. And so you get the situation where there are all these potential vacancies, but they're in the skill shortage category. And I do think that as a new coalition government coming in, trying to solve some of the problems, getting this issue about training the right skills is pretty important.
Well, as you know, the coalition made a big commitment to that, and there are 50,000 extra places on apprenticeships and more. And I think that's the key, obviously, is to encourage young people to take up the skills in an area that needs those particular skills. So I was over the moon when the coalition wrote it into their plan that they would increase those at the same time by 50,000. So that's a good start.
Thanks very much.
I think Harriet Quickland's coming in.
I just wanted to slightly change tack on this transition into work topic and talk about effectively the behavioural aspects of the current benefit system. You outline in the document about the 96% effective marginal tax rate that someone faces in some circumstances going into work, and what a disincentive that is. And the document talks about a 75% benefit withdrawal rate, or a clear rate effectively of increase in income that someone would have overall from extra hours of work. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the modelling that you've been doing at a 75% effective marginal tax rate. How much does that increase the behavioural incentive to work, and how sensitive is the assumption around that rate to the success of encouraging people, giving a behavioural signal for people to go into work?
Okay. The principle behind this idea of the single benefit with what we would call the single taper rate is, at the moment what happens is you have a number of different benefits, between 30 and 50, depends whether you count supplements or not. The official one is around 30, but as I say, there are other additional ones too as well. And often many of them are tapered away at completely different rates. So, for example, housing benefits tapered away at 100%, so for every pound you earn, you take away a pound of housing benefit. Others are tapered away at maybe 70 or 80%, some at 90%. So the problem for that is that if you sit down, the first problem which this would eradicate is that as the Permanent Secretary said earlier on, as an unemployed individual, possibly a lone parent, sits down to look at the prospect of doing anything other than 16 hours, because 16 hours will be clear to them in a sense, because it's particularly influenced by the amount of money that goes in at that point. But behind 16 hours and above 16 hours, there are major cliffs of earnings that you have an awful lot taken away for each hour. So it's very difficult for them to figure out whether or not, if they go on to earn extra hours or work extra hours or work slightly fewer hours, if there was a job for 10 hours or 12 hours, would it be worth their while doing it, because of all these different rates of withdrawal that make it difficult and complicated for them. So the first thing that happens, I think, is that in simplifying that process, you make it much easier for the individual to understand. Now, the Permanent Secretary told us this anecdote about a lone parent coming in front of this person at the job centre, but for every one lone parent that had the courage to do that, there will be many, many more who simply make an assumption that it's just not worth doing that because it sort of doesn't work out. So there's a big problem in knowing that people won't always go in front of an official, because, you might be slightly concerned about what an official might ask them and all the rest of it, so they may not go. So for them, they'll just make an assumption that it didn't work. Too difficult to calculate, can't think it will work, and won't do it. So the first thing simplifying it does, just by the very act of simplifying it, allows them to make that very simple calculation. I know I'm going to retain, they're going to take 75% of what I earn away. That means, here's the figure, this is how much I'm going to earn, I know what's it means. So that simplification helps, and that acts as a bonus for them to say, I can take that decision about taking that work myself, and if it's set at that rate, I can figure out whether it's worthwhile. And then you're into the issue about where do you set the taper. And that, of course, is, at the end of the day, a political decision. That's the decision made by a government that decides the balance between making work pay and getting an earlier return for the exchequer on the money that you already pay somebody on benefits. And that's a legitimate debate. I'm not going to give you the optimum rate at the moment, because the white paper will make that clearer, but that is simply the debate. And obviously, the lower the taper, the more somebody retains of their earnings. You could argue there is a point, there's a greater incentive to financial incentive. Because the key question here that I keep dealing with and people need to understand is somebody needs to be able to make the decision that going to work is better for them than being out of work if they can do it. So to make that choice. It's no good. People say, well, they should go to work because it's right. Of course people should go to work because being in work is better than not. But I can't moralise the people who have perhaps come from a background where no one's ever worked because it doesn't mean anything to them. What they think is being out of work is just the way that things are, and getting to work may be difficult and a problem. So what you have to say is, well, there is a good reason for being in work. It's because you earn more and you have a chance to change your life and improve it. So it seems to me like that's a logic, and I think that by and large, and I may be a bit of an optimist, but I view about human nature is that people will always take the decision that works out best for them and their families. And if that's the case, if we make that decision a bit easier, then they'll take that decision. So we think there's a dynamic effect that takes place once people can see clearly that change would affect their lives. And that taper, the level of it, is the key to...
I mean, the document mentions 75%.
It did, yeah.
That would be a pretty big deterrent to most of us, I think, in terms of a marginal tax rate.
But even now, that would be less than the average marginal tax rate for many of them that are going in lone parenthood. Over 16 hours can be facing withdrawal rates on average close on 95%. So even that would be less, although there may be an argument for a lower one. So.
But just how dynamic is your modelling work in taking into account that behavioural shift at different levels?
As far as I believe and what I understand and the modelling that we've done, and I'm very happy, by the way, to give the Select Committee a proper view and a presentation with all the modelling to show you how it works, and you can test it with questions, and we can try and give you some answers about what happens to different groups. But we believe that, and we're developing it all the time, that it's pretty much taking most of that into consideration.
Karen?
Just a quick question.
Yep.
I think we're all completely convinced by the argument that increasing work incentives through reducing marginal rates of deduction is sensible. But how does this square with the fact that the budget, according to Red Book calculations, actually significantly increases the number of households who will be subject to the highest level of marginal rates of deduction?
Well, without the universal credit, then you could argue that would be the case. That's why my point is, in the process of the spending review, my argument, my debate, my discussions, conversations, have made the point that the universal credit, or the taper, or whatever it happens to be that we decide on, has a massive importance within this, because without it, you could end up in a different situation where you end up going in the opposite direction. So it'll allow you to spread this much easier.
But it's fair to say you haven't, as you've made clear to us already this morning, you haven't actually completed those negotiations. You don't have yet the money or the commitment on that credit. I mean, do you not accept that it seems a little bit perverse, actually, to be having a budget that takes you backwards whilst claiming that your whole principle is to move forwards on that?
Well, Ms. Buck, I didn't, to be fair, I didn't design the position that we're in right now, which is that we have a deficit reduction programme on. I mean, of course, I, hands up, would love to be in the situation in 1997-98 where, the incoming Labour government did not have this problem. We have a problem. I have a commitment. We have a wider commitment to the taxpayer, as you know, to rebalance the economy. And we're trying to do that. What I have made a commitment is to overall try and make sure that whatever changes I make as they stand within this spending cycle do not materially affect or hurt the worst off in society. And I would urge you to look across the balance of the spending review and the budget. So that's why we're sort of halfway through the process. Most of these measures haven't come in yet, won't come in for a while. That's why it's important for us to get to the 20th of October and see the whole thing in the round. And I certainly did not come to this job to see the worst off suffer more. That's the key.
Okay, we've still got lots of different areas to cover. We've now got some questions on the work programme. I think we've already covered some of it, but I think Siobhan's got different things to draw out from that.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, you've already talked a bit about the work programme. Before we get on to the specifics of the framework, can you just talk us through how it's going to be funded?
Well, the work programme is Within the work programme, of course, it will be funded through the department, but at the same time recognising, of course, the purpose of the work programme is to deliver more people in work. And so as we deliver more people in work, there is a benefit saving. And this is the origins of the notion of the Dell-Amy switch, which confuses people quite a lot, and they think it's a sort of electronic implement. It's not. The Dell-Amy switch is that process, which is you spend to save in that process, and as you spend a certain sum of money, you save an awful lot more in return, and that's the key.
How's that actually, the Dell-Amy or Amy-Dell switch? I'm not sure what the correct form
Dell-Amy
is.
is the...
Dell-Amy, fine.
No
how's that actually going to work in practice in terms of, this concept of investing to save? How confident are you that that's, conceptually as well as practically sound? Going to deliver what it's supposed to do?
Well, that is at the moment part of the discussions that we have with the Treasury, who legitimately will ask us, quite legitimately, to be able to prove that concept to them, and once we've done that, then these things will eventually be agreed. But the reality for us is that the work programme is about that, because if there isn't this switch, then it just becomes an expenditure item which saves nothing. In other words, if the work programme doesn't get people back to work, then it becomes a net expenditure, and we won't have succeeded.
Sorry, how advanced is your modelling then on how this...
well, it's pretty advanced. The question is whether we accept over the period of the work programme that forecasts for that are correct. And you'll see those reflected in the autumn statement. You'll forgive me again, as often in the course of these discussions, these questions, I'm not able quite to give you any detail because I'm right in the middle of it right now, and I don't really want to see it on the front pages of the newspapers.
Fair enough.
Not that
they
would do that.
No one's watching. So if we move on from that then, what do you see as the role of Job Centre Plus in the new work programme world of getting people back into off welfare and into work?
Well, Job Centre Plus remains the sort of workhorse of government to get the vast majority of people back to work. That's what it does, and it will continue to do that. And we will, of course, look for better ways to do it, new technology, everything. It's constantly changing. It's not, within the spending review, of course, it's changing, but it's changing all the time because we find better ways and better ways with technology to get people to work. There was a time when you had to go in for an interview, you had to sit down with somebody, you had to discuss the card that was on the board. Now, of course, you can go into a job centre, there's a screen there, you can, dial up on the screen, find the job, you don't have to really talk to anybody if you see a job you want, and it's possible to go from your computer at home to interrogate it, and that's the whole idea. So the more you do that, less contact time sometimes available, and people can find their own jobs on the basis of the Job Centre. So Job Centre remains the workhorse, Job Centre Plus, for getting people back to work. They will also sort of be the gatekeepers to the work programme, because it's Job Centre Plus that, by and large, decides who should go across to the work programme and at what point. Bearing in mind that the idea behind the work programme, because we do not want to start a work programme on somebody that's going to be getting back to work anyway, or that Job Centre Plus can deal with and get them back to work. So by and large, most people won't go to the work programme until they've been out of work for about a year. Some might go earlier. You might be dealing with ex-offenders who have particular problems, maybe young people, NEETs who might go earlier if the Job Centre Plus thinks that they're relevant to. So there's quite a lot of discretion, we believe, should be built in for Job Centre Plus. But by and large, the majority of people won't break through till a year. They may not go through a year if the Job Centre Plus thinks they're in the middle of something which may yield them a job and they feel confident of that. I think it's right to give them the discretion to say, no, I think they don't need to go on the work programme at this point, but these ones do. So that's how it will work with Job Centre Plus.
Job Centre Plus clearly has a lot of expertise in getting harder to help groups back into work, and I'm thinking in particular of the findings of the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee Select Committee report into the Pathways programme, where Job Centre Plus did a hell of a lot better than its private sector counterparts. So you talked about Job Centre Plus still being the gatekeeper. I'm just conscious that in the way that the new work programme is constructed, that Job Centre Plus is still able to actually give that better value for money service that it's proven to have given.
Two things about the Pathways programme, which the media reported, and I think some of it they got slightly wrong. almost the first thing we did when we came in was to stop the Pathways programme, because we'd already seen the audit officer's reports on it, and we'd reached the conclusion that didn't work. The second thing about the Pathways programme was that, remember, it was very narrowly, it was focused particularly really on incapacity benefit, but it wasn't really in the same area that much of the work programme is. The other bit about it, or two or three other interesting bits about it, which were quite important. Remember that what we're doing with incapacity benefit, a thing we inherited from the last government, which I wholly agreed with, by the way, which was the migration process to employment support allowance. And for the most part, well, in fact, it hasn't at all, hadn't started on the stock of those people. So Pathways was trying to figure out who from that more difficult group would be able to get into work without that migration process and assessment taking place. So the reason why I think Pathways failed also, it was rather rigid. You sort of had 6 interviews. They didn't really have a lot of scope, the people doing it, to do very much with you other than to interview in a very linear way and not to be able to look at you in a wider sense and figure out what you need. And the last part about it was the payment to Pathways. It's about 30% paid as a sort of statutory payment for doing the work. If you look at the figures for that, actually about 75% of all the monies received by those organisations taking it on were as a result of the 30% payment, not the remaining 70%, which would have been for success payment by results. So understanding all of that, the work programme, first of all, doesn't deal just with people coming off incapacity benefit, although it will deal with those coming in from the new assessments from the migration programme, the work capability assessment. And by the way, they're the one group that will be seen immediately by the work programme. They won't go through Job Centre, they will go straight to the work programme because they will be seen as having particular problems from the stock. But then 2 other things will be important which allow us to not to repeat the mistakes of Pathways, which is quite important. As I understand it, first of all, whilst we will pay them a fee at the beginning, which is a cash flow fee for taking on this particular individual, then there's a time lag of at least 13 weeks before they will receive another payment. That's for 2 good reasons. One is that if people rotate in and out of work, as they might do, then there's no point in paying them money for something which simply didn't work. Secondly, it allows us to adjust whether, and we will, I can't go into too much detail about the contractual arrangements, which will be slightly varied. It allows us to adjust within those contractual arrangements whether we think these people might have made work or not. It also allows us to set differentials, and they didn't have this for Pathways. More difficult people should receive more money for getting them into work. And the last bit, which is very important, is that we are going to pay them to keep people in work for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months a year. We're still working out how that's done, but the reality is it's very important to me. That's almost the most important bit, which is sustain people in work over a long period, not just get them into work. We've tended to say, into work, great, no problems, turn away, do something else. Not good. Into work for people who haven't had work for a long time, you've got to stay with them. And we know that from Tomorrow's People and others who mentor people into work. They have fantastic results of the more difficult to get into work. So that's what basically the work programme will do on the back of the work capability assessment. And this is where Pathways, I think, early on, whilst well-intentioned, we've learnt a lot from it.
I mean, I'll come on to the differential payments in a minute, but I'm just conscious that, you know, as you're creating this framework for the work programme, it's going to be important, and this does, I mean, I don't want to rehearse the arguments of the Public Accounts Committee report, but basically it's going to be important to make sure that you have a proper, sustainable balance between public providers, private sector and voluntary as well. And that's the only way over the longer term you're going to be able to see whether it's giving you good value for money and compare performance across the different sectors. So how are you going to make sure that you do have that balance?
It's inscribed inside me that the voluntary sector, the community sector, will play a very significant part in this. And I will simply not allow that this work programme goes ahead, and I can give that guarantee to the committee, if I think that is not going to be the case. So we need to look at ways in which we can ensure this, for good reasons, not just because we want to be generous to the voluntary sector. That's not the point. The real point is I actually genuinely believe that the more local you are, the more you're going to be able to understand, A, what's happening in the local business area, and B, what's happening to the individual. And that's why all the experience I've had, CSJ and everything else, talking to people in every area, tells me that we need to lock into that local intelligence and understand it. Now, of course, job centres are local, but it's important that we have, when we contract with the larger companies, which may well be the case, that we localise them through that process. And so it's going to be very important for them to have within their consortia, as it were, very clear references to those individuals locked into that process. I can't give you the exact contractual details because we're still discussing those, but I can guarantee to Beg that I will make sure it's clear to them, and maybe the Minister for Employment will be able to come forward on this one as well. But my point is, it's very important that we deliver that way because it will improve the delivery process and will not repeat the mistakes that the Pathways programme had.
My impression of the approach so far was that, you know, your relationship and the way the department views its relationship is very much with the prime providers, and it doesn't go beyond that. So you've had very little to do with the subcontractors, who tend to be the local or small organisations that actually do the delivery, especially with the harder to help groups. They're the ones that have the coalface experience. So you're going to be much more proactive then in terms of your involvement with the subcontractors and your expectations of the primes and how they're going to work with the subcontractors and how the financial risk is going to be balanced and all those other, you know, all the contract bits.
It's a obviously this is a very serious concern of yours and quite legitimate. And I just want to bring the Permanent Secretary in because he can tell you a little bit more about some of that negotiation discussion. But just let me assure you that I have already spoken to the Minister responsible for this. And I've made it absolutely clear to him, and he agrees with me, that this is the case. Now, why is this an issue at the moment? Well, because at the moment we're dealing with those who have the capacity to take on the contract. And whilst there may be voluntary sector providers or consortia of voluntary sector providers that may want to do that, by and large my sense is that they may not be of a scale big enough to be able to do that. But that doesn't mean they can't play an absolute valuable part in it. And so that's the point. So at the moment we're talking about the top level lot, but there may be others. Do you want to say anything further?
Well, just a couple of things. One is to say that we do actually and have had a great deal of contact, direct contact with not only organisations like Akivo representing third sector partners and providers, but with many third sector providers. So we do have a very continuing and ongoing dialogue. And the second is that we already have in place something called the Merlin Standard. I can't quite find, even as Permanent Secretary, anybody in the department who knows why we called it the Merlin Standard, incidentally, but it is there to set out precisely a code of practice, setting out our expectations of how not only we, but prime providers ought to work with the third and voluntary sector.
I'm going to try and move on quickly, but I'll bring Kate and Stephen in. Did you want to come back and everything else?
I just had an issue about the harder to help groups and differential payments.
Right, I'll bring Kate and Stephen in and I'll come back. Yeah.
Mine is just a very quick question. Given that a very much larger and mixed client group will be on JSA in the future and then potentially moving into the work programme, including lone parents and people who've perhaps undertaken the work capability assessment but been unsuccessful, just to check out whether in the IT system we will be able to flag the way in which people arrived into the programme, because it will be important to know how well it delivers, for example, for lone parents or for people who have some level of health problems, albeit not sufficient to get them into ESA in the future.
Yeah. Two things about that. The first is that, of course, I said it earlier and I just restate it again, those who've been migrated to the work capability assessment out of incapacity benefit into JSA, they will pretty well automatically go on to the work programme.
And will we flag them? Will we know? We will know who they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll go back and check, and I'll give you an assurance of that. But my understanding is that's the case, but I will absolutely check on that. Second thing about lone parents is that whilst we've lowered the age of expectation for lone parents to school age, approximately 5, I have, however, said that absolutely Job Centre Plus officials retain the flexibility to make sure that what they ask them to do fits within their caring responsibilities. And as you may remember, Job Centre Plus has that. They will retain that. So you'll be able to track that anyway as well. So the key thing is that, yes, you're right, there'll be a more mixed group in there, but we'll certainly want to track how that mixed group works, particularly as the one group's going off to the work programme straight away.
And Stephen?
Secretary of State, I would also like to seek reassurance that, as well as having some provision specifically for the larger suppliers to include the voluntary sector, that the SME training companies and employability companies in that area, who also don't have the scale to bid for the large project, but in my experience can make a tremendous difference in actually delivering, that's also part of your thinking, because I wouldn't want them to miss out.
It is, unless the Permanent Secretary now contradicts me.
That's a nice short answer, so I'll come back to Shamina.
Just a final point on sort of the third sector, smaller organisations. With the differential payment system and the payment by outcomes, obviously there's going to be a much longer time frame over which the different providers will be paid, and money will filter through down to their subcontractors. Yep. So some of the much smaller organisations will obviously struggle with the longer time scale for payment. Apart from groups, for example, that provide psychiatry services where they expect upfront payment. How are you going to try and protect those and make sure that they're able to operate effectively?
Mood, you've hit on a very important point. You've obviously been doing your homework on this, because if you're really, and I would also invite you in to come and see the Minister to discuss it with him, because it is an area that we are at the moment working out. There are two issues we've got to recognise. We've got to recognise a return for the taxpayer within this. But we also have to recognise the incentive to the company. And the third area, of course, is recognising also that there is a cash flow issue for companies and for private sector and voluntary sector small organisations. So those three things come together. I know, having been on board of companies, that how important cash flow, some say cash flow is more important than anything else in the management of the company. And cash flow means payments at times over set periods and early periods. So this is still at the moment being discussed and figured out. The balance for us has to be that we get the taxpayer and we get the incentives right, but also they have something that allows them to be able to say, well, we can run this and run it well. One important point is that where there is a larger company that has taken this on, we don't want them to try and pass on dramatic amounts of risk down to the lower groups. So that's an area that we are conscious of, and we will try and work out within the contract. So it's a complicated process. But have I missed anything out on this?
No, the only thing I'd add is that will be absolutely one of the criteria that we will be taking into account when we get to the point of actually selecting the large prime providers, will be what they propose, what they put forward, what assurances they give in relation to the chain of providers below them.
But do come in. I'll tell the Minister that you're, and if that met anybody, if you've got a particular concern, but I'm very happy that you should come in, and if you've got a thought or an idea on it, we're open to it.
I think today we're not going to get through half of your remit, so we might be inviting you back here as well for some of these things. I'll try and be very quick, because I was glad to hear you said that those who are migrating from IB onto ESA will go straight into the work programme. Of course, there's a group of people who won't go onto the work programme. Not ESA, JSA. JSA, sorry, yep. From yes, who fail to get onto ESA and end up on GSA. But there's a group of people for whom that won't happen, and they're my constituents, because they will start to get the letters next month to invite them into, because the test of that migration from IB to ESA will happen, and of course the work programme won't be up until a few months after that whole process has been completed. So, the question I suppose I'm asking is, have you done any work and on the numbers you think will fail the work capabilities assessment that will end up on GSA and therefore onto the work programme from the IB cohort? Now that's going to be totally different from the ones who fail the work capabilities assessment who are new claimants, because these people will have already been through a gateway. And have you got a figure in your mind? And as you're looking for that, because the other thing that worries me, that you're only starting in Aberdeen and Burnley next month, probably it'll be November till any assessments are done, but you're going to roll it out nationwide by spring 2011. Is that long enough to learn the lessons?
Well, first of all, I recognise that particular issue and problem, and it's something that I will ask the Minister, Chris Grayling, to talk to you about a little bit more and see whether or not there are interim measures we can take. We are, of course, as you know, trialling both with you and Burnley, so they're two very different cities with very different prospects for many of them. So we should get a very strong early steer about how this is going to work from that. But I'll certainly take on in. So you actually you can't quantify how many are going to fail the work capability? Well, I'll give you some figures actually on this where we estimate things to be, and I'll just remind everybody where we were, and I've just got the figures in front of me now. Of those who are assessed through the WCA so far on the flow, and this is the flow, and I agree with you, it isn't an absolute indication. 68% have been deemed fit for work. Some 23% have gone to the work-related activity group and 9% have gone to the sport group. Now, to be fair, that's the flow, and the flow is an easier group to look at of that. And of our estimations of where we are, first of all, we're going to be trying to get through around about 10,000 a week, when it starts. The predicted figures for migration flow are in the order of 23% fit for work, so slightly different from the previous one. About 58% will move to the work-related activity group, and about 19% will head to the support group. So lesser numbers going, but still significant numbers across. Now, these are estimates that are conservative, I think, in the sense that we won't really know whether they're a bit too conservative till we start to see what's happening in those two cities. Because
obviously the crucial thing is the gateway to get on to ESA, which is the work capabilities assessment. There are lots of complaints about Atos healthcare and how they carry out their assessments. Is the Atos are they going to carry on? Is the contract, is it a long one? Are you in negotiation with them to look again? Lots and lots of complaints about the rigidity of the medical assessment and how it doesn't really take into account things like fluctuating conditions, mental health and all of those things.
I agree. We've already made changes, as you know. We've got an external independent review, and I can give you the names of the people that are on the scrutiny group, and the Permanent Secretary may want to say a little bit more about this. Paul Farmer, Chief Executive of Mine, Professor David Haslam, National Clinical Advisor, Care Quality Commission, Dr. Olivia Carlton, Head of Occupational Health, Transport for London, and Neil Lennox, Head of Health, Safety and Fire at Sainsbury's. They will be acting as a scrutiny group to Professor Malcolm Harrington's, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Birmingham, and he will lead the independent review. So they will act as a scrutiny group to him. They've already recommended some changes, which are quite important, and we've implemented some of these and plan to do that. First of all, to ensure that individuals awaiting chemotherapy are treated in the same way as those already receiving it, and you'll know that we announced that we make that change. Expand the support group to cover more people with communication problems and severe disabilities due to mental health conditions. Take account of someone's adaptation to a condition of disability and simplify the language of the descriptors. Most of all, basically try and make the system more responsive to the fact that some people will come in front of the assessors and be different a day later, and to understand more what's in their medical records. And I think that's reflected in this, but that's the nature. Do you want to add anything to that, or I missed them?
No, not at all. The only thing perhaps I'd add is that we do, as we do with all of our providers, maintain a very, very active dialogue with Atos Healthcare. We take up individual cases where we have any reason ourselves to believe that there's a kind of something prima facie odd about the decision. I mean, one issue which I'm sure every Member of Parliament will know from their own postbag is that, in a sense, we perhaps need to do more to explain to people that the nature of the assessment is not whether Mr. or Mrs. or Miss Smith has this condition. It is whether that condition prevents them from undertaking some or any work. So some of the cases that cross my desk, as I'm sure they'll cross the desks of members, are where, in a sense, there are two different issues. The individual is saying, but I have this condition, here's the evidence from my doctor, my GP, my consultant, etc. But the capability assessment, of course, is not disputing that the individual has that condition. It's trying to assess with that, what is that individual's capability for work?
Thank you, Chair. We had representations and briefings from various charities and lobby groups that represent disabled people and people with health issues. And one of the firm's recommendations that was coming from those groups was that to help people with disabilities and mental health issues back into work, they would like to see the involvement of their healthcare specialists, not just the Job Centre Plus and the work programme specialists. And I wondered, first of all, whether that had come through to you in the consultation, and also what discussions you've had with the health Department of Health on that matter.
I think, and again, the Permanent Secretary may want to add to this slightly, but as far as I understand it, there have been ongoing discussions with the Health Department over this. We are, as I made clear, they're looking again very much at the structure of the way that this is assessed to see whether or not there is scope to improve that. Generally, though, the consensus amongst most of them so far has been that this is a reasonable process, that it's not a process that is, by and large, unfair or unbalanced. Recognise that occupational health people sometimes are better at assessing people than pure medical people, in the sense that they have a better sense of what their requirements are. So understanding all of that, assurance I suppose I can give you is that we will continue to keep that under review, and whether or not this becomes a requirement and it's one that we can demonstrate would actively improve the system, then we'd be want to accept it. I don't know if
only to add a little, that one thing that was in place under the previous administration and the present government is continuing is the appointment of Dame Carol Black, who is one of the most eminent occupational health practitioners in the country, who interestingly kind of has a responsibility to both our department and to the Department of Health, reports jointly to both, and has been, I think, instrumental in creating a kind of a change of climate, change of mind, almost, not just within parts of government, but actually with parts of the medical community. And there's been a lot of work, I'm sure you're aware of some of this, with, in particular, the general practitioners and the College of General Practitioners, looking towards their role in the system, which can be absolutely critical in, kind of how a general practitioner responds when someone walks through their surgery and says, "Doctor, I'm under stress," can actually send someone one way in a rather helpful way, or another way in a less helpful way. So all I can say is, certainly in my time as PermSec, I've not seen greater cooperation than we have today with the health department. It's very close.
Just very quickly before Liz, is the Atos contract, is it up for renewal anytime soon?
I haven't got that date in my head, so let us write to you.
It will be up for renewal, but I can't give you the exact.
I don't think it's immediately up for renewal, but let us write to you.
Okay, I'm going to have to invoke the speakers. Short questions, short answers. Perhaps as Chief, I should have been moving things along sooner, but Margaret,
I will be well behaved, Chair. Try. Secretary of State, you have genuinely worked very hard, I think, to tackle poverty, and you've got a commitment to that, which I think is respected across the political field. Are you worried that that might have been undermined by the budget and reactions to the budget? Now, I know what you said to Karen Buck, and of course none of us want to cut expenditure, and you feel obliged that you have to do that. We can argue about that, I'm not going to go into that. But nonetheless, the very reputed organisation, Institute for Fiscal Studies, has said the point about the budget was that it wasn't fair and actually disproportionately affected people in poverty more. Now, doesn't that worry you, particularly given your energy in this field?
Yeah, of course it would worry me, except that I would again come back to a previous answer that I gave, which is to try and see the whole process in the round. That is to say, we haven't quite finished yet. So overall, to see a spending review completes the process, whereas there was usually you would say the budget, but as we know we have the spending review following in the emergency budget. I think given the fact that we'll have only been in for a few months, I think you need to see all of that, and then we can make a proper judgment. I have seen the IFS figures, I do recognise that. I'm not sure I altogether agree with the IFS, because they are making some quite big assumptions in here about areas which they themselves admit are quite difficult to calculate, and we think on balance that they veered onto the side of being critical for that. We did put a lot of money in to the child tax credit to alleviate any idea that what we were doing in the budget would have been in any way damaging to our child poverty targets, and there was a lot of money pushed through on that score. So there's been a constant reminder that we're trying throughout to protect the most vulnerable. I recognise there are some issues around one or two areas, but my point is that let's complete this process on the 20th of October, and then I think we can take a much better view. Clearly, I want to protect the most vulnerable within this process, because they are the ones that have to, at the end of the day, be best served by this, because at the end, that's what this system is all about, to help the worst off in society, improve the quality of life, and where possible to get back to work.
I absolutely appreciate that, and I do think what some of the organisations are saying is they recognise your commitment to that. It's a practice at the end of the day that we have to examine. And I know the Chancellor quoted the Institute of Fiscal Studies when that point was made to him in the House the other day, but unfortunately he only quoted half the sentence that the IFS had said. He didn't quote the other half, which went on to say that most of the losses for the upper half, he quoted saying the upper half have had a hit as well, but most of the losses for the upper half result from pre-announced measures, from measures that were introduced by the last government. So if you just look solely at what your government has done, the conclusion is irrevocably that it's hit the poorest harder, and that's what the IFS would stand with. Now, are you telling me that will be settled when we see the spending review? You'll make up for it in the spending review?
Two things I would argue with that. First of all, I don't know that it is quite legitimate to separate overall activity in reducing the deficit. So even if the last government did some work, I mean, to be fair, the key thing is what is the sum outcome at the end of it, not if you take this away from that, where does that leave you? Because I know you can look at things in isolation, but the reality for us has to be that when we get to the end of the October process, that on balance, across all the work that was done, have we protected the most vulnerable? I believe we will. That's what I'm in the middle of discussions about at the moment, and we hope to complete that process. And that's really where we are. I mean, after all, your own party in government had plans itself to reduce spending by some 40%. So I think there is a big issue here about where those would have fallen as well. And we have choices to make. These are not choices any one of us has relished on arrival in government. I don't arrive and rub my hands and say, whoopee, I can now make some really good decisions about cutting some of these benefits. My point is, I've tried to take those decisions on balance to make sure that they protect the worst off. And bear in mind, some of these decisions are anyway not within my department.
Yes, exactly.
So tax
but the
credits and child
protest
benefits
is whether or not it's a fair budget, irrespective, we can argue about that.
Accept that.
Can we assume from your answer, therefore, that the spending review will be fair and will not disproportionately affect disadvantaged groups, from your perspective?
Yeah, I believe that to be the case. I answer for what I propose, and I believe that is in the heart and mind of the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and Chancellor as well. How we achieve that, of course, is the discussion.
Okay.
Pleasant conversations that we have been having
to be continued, I think,
over the last few weeks.
Can I ask one other question, if that's okay? And that was about the switch to CPI for the uprating of benefits. You will know that IFS, Joseph Rowntree, many other organisations are very concerned about this. I think Citizens Advice said it results in a 1% real terms reduction in the value of benefits. Now, if you go to places and say we really want to tackle poverty, but one of your first acts in government is to de facto create a 1% real terms reduction in the value of benefits, doesn't that undermine that?
Well, it depends which way, I guess, you really look at this. I mean, it's possible to look at what we did and just say, well, projecting ahead, this means that there is a loss. But the question is, what is that loss? The key point about the difference, and this is where I reached this conclusion when I was presented with the facts, was that whilst we have been uprating in line with RPI, the question is, what does RPI represent in terms of the way that we calculate benefits? And there are two areas in RPI which are fascinating. The first is RPI has in it, which is what makes it so volatile, a dramatic amount of mortgage-based housing costs. Well, first of all, most of the recipients, most of the claimants, most of the people involved in the benefit structure don't have that as a major issue for them at all. And even when you deal with pensioners, they either, by this stage, own their own homes outright or they're on some form of housing benefit. So the housing costs, such as housing benefit, are in fact separated from, separate housing from the uprating. The second part, which is important, which I didn't realise, was that I think the interesting thing about RPI was it does not take into account pensioners who have 75% of their income in benefits, in other words, in support. It doesn't take any account of that, and inside its basket of commodities that they use and calculate what inflation is, they were never in that mix at all. So actually, it wasn't really great for pensioners by and large. There's a third area too, and I know this may be seen by some as exceptional, but it was only a year ago that RPI plunged below zero. And had we absolutely followed RPI down, we would have actually reduced and literally cut benefits to reflect where RPI was. CPI, I've more and more come to consideration, RPI is a sort of peculiar British measure that because we have such a housing issue in the way we calculate it, distorts things. And in actual fact, CPI is used by the Bank of England, more and more government, and I think also, I understand through casual conversations with some of your colleagues in the last Labour government, that there was a lot of discussion about moving eventually to CPI because there's less distortion and it's clearer, it's international. The basket of items does not change in the way that they do with RPI. They come and go. They change them quite quickly. With CPI, it's a much more steady basket that, a government can't simply say we're going to pluck something out and put something in, because being international, it therefore is a much more stable version. So I recognise that when you just look ahead on a projection against that, or in some cases Rossi, some groups will look like they're losing money. But in fact, the question to ask is, at cost of living, are they losing? And the answer is, I don't think they are, because I think CPI calculates that in a much more reasonable way.
But do you think that shift to RPI or CPI, do you think that will affect the poverty levels? Do you think poverty numbers will increase because of that decision?
I actually don't think that would be the case, because, as I said, the benchmark here is, had we lowered it below, cost of living, then the answer would have been yes. But we're not. What we're doing is we're trying to figure out what is the cost of living. And I know, the argument will go, you should have stayed with RPI because they will get more money. And, in a perfect world, you might have said, yes, you can afford to do this.
People are actually losing money.
Yeah, looking ahead, are they losing money or are they settled on what is essentially cost of living? My view is that it's, we have to make choices. And my choices were that keeping them on a proper measure of cost of living would be the right way of what inflation really is. And that, to my mind, is CPI, not RPI. And I keep coming back to the fact that, we have to make choices, and a choice that says, do you go by a scale that is based on housing costs that aren't in reality relevant, and does not include pensioner costs for those who are the worst off pensioners? I think it's a pretty flawed process. And whilst the direct calculation will, of course, allow you to make that very simple statement that there is a reduction, my sense is that we're a reduction against what? And the real calculation that CPI offers us, which I think more and more government generally will move to, is, I think, a reasonable measure.
My final question, Chair, I promise. Do you think at the end of the spending review, then people who are currently on benefits, generally speaking, their benefits won't be going down, it will be at the same value, if not increasing?
Well, I can't guarantee they'll be the same value as, in the sense that they're purchasing value. The key question I want to ask is, are the benefits that we pay people? I mean, I'm not reducing the overall amount that people are paid in benefits. My job is here to try and make sure that people who need benefits and support get the relevant benefits and support that allow them to live a life which, is supported. Hopefully they can help them change those circumstances and move out of that. That's the key. So overall, the only guarantee I give is that we will do our absolute level best to protect the worst off and make sure they don't suffer in the process of this need to find savings.
I want to try and get some questions on pensions. We're going to get to other things, and I'm going to try and finish. It might be after past. I hope that's all right, Secretary of State. But first I want to bring, because on housing costs, I want to bring Karen Buck in.
Thanks very much. Secretary of State, you referred earlier to some of the areas of what we understand as welfare but aren't actually within your budget, particularly child benefit. I mean, would you be making representations to the Treasury not to, for example, reduce the maximum age at which child benefit is paid to 16, as is being speculated today?
It's incredibly tempting to answer that question, but I hope you'll understand that, tempting as it is to watch you ask that question, I will have to hope with the acceptance of the Chair that I duck my shoulders on that one.
You don't have a view on it?
I have a view, but the view is a private view.
Private view as an individual or private view as Secretary of State?
Later, but it is certainly private view.
But not a private view as the Secretary of State?
Well, I am in a process at the moment that is discussing and negotiating where we go on these things, and I simply say that I can neither stand up or stand down things that I see in the newspapers today or yesterday or the day before in that process. And I think it's only fair to say it's not far to go till the 20th of October when we will see what we actually decide rather than what may well or may not be
I was simply asking you what your view was and whether you would make representations on the issue or had made representations.
Yeah, now I would love to have a view in this committee that I would be free to express at this point, but I think, to be fair, my view and the reality of what we do are one and the same.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer's view, expressed in the BBC, was that an additional £4 billion would be removed from the Department of Work and Pensions budget. You said that you didn't recognise that figure, and indeed the Chancellor wouldn't be drawn on that on Monday, but he did actually use that figure. When was the first time you were aware of it?
As I understand it, the interview, he didn't give a figure. that somehow this other figure crept into the media. I cannot confirm how that happened, but it did. But he himself did not actually quote that figure. So the figure itself is not a figure that he has stood up at any stage. And as I said earlier on, we're in the middle of this process, so I don't recognise any figures that get into the newspapers, much as it might be interesting to.
Okay. Can I just ask you one or two questions quickly about housing benefit, which is an area of enormous concern to me, amongst others. But you, again, were talking earlier, and it's a perfectly valid argument that it's difficult for people in social housing to move to different parts of the country to find work, and it is a genuine dilemma about how one resolves that. But people in the private rented sector on housing benefit, there are 220,000 extra claimants on housing benefit in the private rented sector in work in the last 2 years. Your budget proposals will, for almost all, possibly all of those claimants, will make it impossible for them to remain in their homes or leave them substantially worse off. And the theory behind this is to make them move to find cheaper accommodation. What is the logic of asking almost 250,000 working claimants on housing benefit to move to find cheaper accommodation, but people in cheaper accommodation in other parts of the country are being asked to move to more expensive accommodation to find work?
I can understand the concern about the housing benefit changes, but I think, if you don't mind saying so, we've got to understand the nature of the problem that I faced on arrival, which is that we have a housing benefit budget which had really ballooned over the last 5 years. I mean, literally rising pretty much close on $1 billion a year, and set to rise at an even more accelerated rate. And the problem we've got within the local housing allowance area of it was a lot of that's driven by rent rises. Now, it may be questionable as to what the purpose of the people that own the properties is, and by pushing up the rents, and whether they take into consideration that for them it seemed to be an open-ended prospect with those who are being paid through the local housing allowance. They would simply have to meet that ever-extending level of rent. So the first thing is we have to try and get it under control. The main point to make is, and I understand it's not easy, but I am not actually cutting these benefit rates. I am simply bringing them at the level at which they increase down. They're still increasing. I have actually been attacked by somebody for not cutting housing benefit. What I've actually done, if you look at the graphs, you'll see that it's going at that rate and we're bringing it down to that rate. So we are, of course, planning to save some money on that. How will that affect people? Well, I recognise there's an effect, which is why I put another 40 million, I think it was, into the... well, we've kept this. We will keep this under review. The 40 million makes it a total of 60 million available now to local authorities for transitional relief, and I am prepared to continue to review that, depending on how we discuss that with local authorities. But the reality for us is we've looked at this and tried to figure out where this would affect people, and it will, obviously within London there will be a particular and greater effect because, of course, the rental levels are higher, particularly higher in central parts of London. But, you know, there is another aspect which says that, look, also the levels of some of these rents being paid to people acts as a major disincentive for them to take work, because once they take work and start to lose their housing benefit or support, they simply wouldn't be able to afford the property they're in anyway and would probably have to move. And there's a second aspect too, which is for those who are on lower income, who could never even begin to afford houses in this category, who are working, it's for them, many of them feel it's deeply unfair that they are expected to travel to work, to commute to work, to live in accommodation which is tailored to their own employment levels and to the amount they earn. That to them seems as deeply unfair. Now, I recognise there will be some problems, and we're asking councils to look at this early and to discuss with us what those problems are, and we'll try and have some sort of remedial process in that. But the reality for us is the last government, your party in government, I know, was looking at this area, and there was deep concern in Downing Street under the then Prime Minister that these figures were rising at the rate they were rising, which were, even to talk to some of your colleagues, ex-ministers, who told me privately this is an area they would have had to have moved on anyway. We have to find a way of bringing it back under control. and I'm afraid I've done just that.
Last question, Chair. I don't think any of us would be happy to defend the extent to which private landlords have enjoyed something of a bonanza over the long term. The question is how you achieve a desirable end without penalising, and you didn't, with respect, answer my question about 250,000 working households on housing benefit who are going to be, for the most part, slaughtered by this. But how you do this without a great deal of disruption and hardship. And actually, the primary driver of the increase in housing benefit expenditure in recent years has been the shift in numbers from social tenures to private tenures. 100,000 people in the last year alone placed there by local authorities. Mm-hmm. Almost all of those people are going to have a legitimate claim as homeless to their local authorities next year, thereby saving nothing. What discussions are you having with DCLG about what impact this is going to have on homelessness, and indeed whether those savings are simply going to be false economies, because it's simply going to have to be picked up by another department?
I accept all of that, and that's what we've been looking at, except in the sense that we have to discuss with DCLG, and we're deep in discussions with them, and also individual councils too. We've encouraged them to discuss their issues and their problems with us. I just come back to the simple point, which is we simply have to find a way of getting this back under control, because it is not feasible for any government now to spend at the rate that we were spending and to watch the explosion in cost. I accept, and you're right, absolutely right, Mr. Buck, that some of this has been driven by the numbers moving into local housing allowance who might in the past have been expected to be in social housing, where the average rent is lower, although there has been under the last government a desire to push the rents up in social housing. We thought and believed, after all the work that we did looking at this, I asked questions, Parliament, what was the best way for us to try and bring it under control, to put pressure on the fewest and smallest number of people and find some remedial way in which we can help them.
Well,
we're going to disagree about that. And I understand that, but I can say, honestly, it's having been in opposition, sat in the back, of course, it's legitimate to complain about this and say this is wrong. But the only question I ask is, where else would we have gone to find a way of reducing this and bringing it back under control in the timescale necessary? And that's the real key question. If there's a better idea, I'm open to a suggestion.
The committee will be looking at this as part of its first proper inquiry, so we will be, I'm sure, returning to it, although I suspect it will be your junior minister will be in the chair rather than yourself at that case. But I do want to go and get questions on pensions, because it obviously is a large part of your responsibility as the department. I hope you're all okay to stay for an extra 10-15 minutes, if that's
I'm
in order.
your hands.
We'll be out the door certainly before Prime Minister's questions. But Karen Bradley.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, we've already touched on the fact that the state pension is a very large proportion of the AMI budget of the department.
Yep.
And one of the approaches to dealing with that massive part of the budget is to increase the state pension age. So on that topic, first of all, I know there's been a review. Simple question, when are you likely to be announcing the results of that review?
We're not yet, but we will when we complete it, which I think is later in October, if I remember off the top of my head. So we will certainly draw you all in, particularly, obviously, the Select Committee. I mean, can I just say, I think this is it's a really important debate for two good reasons. The first is that I wish politicians in the past, and I don't mean any particular political party, but all of us had tackled this earlier, in the sense of trying to get a national debate going about at what age really do we think is the age at which people should officially be ready for retirement. After all, when we set this back in 1924, I think it was, I think actually men never made the retirement age on average, and women made it to 70 or 71. Today, a boy, I think a child born today, a male child, life expectancy will be 89 years, and a girl 92 years. And I think 1 in 4 male children born today will live to be 100, and 2 in 4 girl children will live to be 100. So you can see that there is a dramatic effect. So likely at the moment, if we don't change anything, you can expect to live about a third of your life in retirement. Now, two things are important about that. I don't want to be mean about this and say you have no right to enjoy your retirement. But the reality is we have a smaller number of people in work projected forward that will have to support those who are retired, and that's how it works. So that burden grows on them, in effect, sort of earlier and earlier retirement de facto. So we have to bear them in mind. My children and grandchildren, as they come forward, they won't thank people like me and us for not taking this decision early. And the second bit is, I think more and more people reaching retirement age now actually are choosing to work because they don't feel like they should simply stop work at 60 or 65. And as you know, we're equalising the age, retirement age, and then moving to 66 by 2020. The key point here is that they do want to work, and so working is an option that we want to give them. And of course, one of the key things was to get rid of the default retirement age, which I was really pleased that we've agreed with the business department to finally get rid of that. I know some businesses, big companies, don't like us for doing that, but frankly, I think that many of them have been quite slack about doing this. They've waited for someone to come to 65 and chuck them out. My answer is you now need to figure out the last 10 years of someone's working life, how best to make the most of their talents. In Germany, I see they lock new entrants into work with older people, and they get the best out of both of them. They get actually improvements from them. So it's time for us in Britain to start being a little more flexible and relevant, and not just to lose all that talent that exists and intellect that exists at 65 years old or 60.
Thank you. You talked about 2020. I know 2016 has been mooted as the date at which the retirement age may go up to 66. There are bodies that believe that 6 years is not long enough for people to make plans for the increase in the retirement age, and I just wondered if you could give some comments on that.
I mean, first of all, it's a not before, by the way. It's not before 2016, and I understand the concerns, and with that they've been part of the review generally. At the moment, I can't tell you how that review will affect us, but I can say that so far the balance seems to be that it is workable, but it may be that I'm not seeing all the responses to the review. So, yes, you can argue it's a short enough time, but I think generally most people are beginning to accept that that is a process they're engaged in, started by the last government, obviously, which accepted. I mean, further than that, the question is how far do you go beyond 66, and that's part of the whole discussion, I think, which is relevant. It is interesting, of course, somebody retiring, every year that they defer their pension increases by between about 6% to 10%, and each year that is worth about 1% of GDP, it's around about £13 billion to the state. So there are big, we talk a lot about the benefits, but this is much bigger numbers, really, than anything we discuss with working age benefits.
Thank you. Just final point on the increase in the state pension age, and we've touched on, you've spoken about the sort of statistical life expectancy, but there is a demographic that doesn't have that life expectancy, and actually perhaps won't even expect to reach state pension age, and certainly not get many years after that. I just wondered if there was going to be anything in the review or anything in the proposals that would help that demographic.
Well, absolutely right. I mean, there are pockets around Britain, and deference to you on this one. I think I think it was Carlton. I think might expect it's about 55 or something. Appalling, really. But they're not alone. There are pockets all around the rest of the UK. It's very difficult sometimes to exactly understand quite how those figures are. But it's very difficult. I think what we have to do is make policy for the majority with regards to retirement, because it is the vast majority that will project to live much further forward. What we do about those pockets of deep entrenched poverty, ill health, are issues that my department has to face up to and try and change that. But I don't think the pension age, we couldn't set the pension age around those pockets. What we have to do is try and figure out how we change that with the health department and ourselves. And they've been pretty resistant over the years to work, but I guess we have to do a lot more. I think getting people active, into work, dealing with their health issues and problems is all part of that process. But they're a focus that's separate from the pensionable age. I recognise that. Do you want to say?
Can I just add one almost small footnote? Of course, as a department, we're a huge employer, as well as, of course, a major strategic and policy department. And we were the first department, now about, I think, 4 years ago, to remove any upper retirement age for our own employees. That's now standard right across the civil service, but we were the first. So now our staff can go on working to any age as long as they're competent to do the job, and there's a job there for them to do. And at the time when we were discussing discussing this and introduced that, there were real concerns around my top team table as to whether this was going to build in inflexibility, whether we were going to be able to reduce numbers, which we were at the time. There aren't anymore, and we've got almost 1,000 people now working on beyond their state retirement age. And universally, they do a really good job, and it has not led to any of the inflexibilities that people worried about at the time. Interestingly, they're very often working on a part-week, part-time basis. They bring a lot of maturity and experience to the people around them, and it's been wholly beneficial for us.
Kate Green.
I just wondered if you could say something about what you perceive to be the potential implications for occupational pension schemes of increasing the state retirement age or removing the default retirement age.
We don't think that there will be a major problem for those pensions. So we think that, by and large, in our discussions, that they haven't raised major issues surrounding that. There will be issues to be settled about it, but I think the drift forward, for them, many of them have been financing very early retirement in some of those cases. And I think all of us recognise that the days for those very early retirements is gone. One of the reasons why some of the deficits are in place is because people have been funded for early retirement, which is simply not affordable. But the discussion so far, there hasn't been a major complaint that we're heading in the wrong direction from them, as I understand it. But again, when we have the review and publish the results, you'll definitely see whether they're complaining about that.
Do you think there has been any modelling of what different scenarios might result, either by the industry or by you, and will that be revealed in the review?
Well, definitely the modelling going on, and we'll try. I'll try. It might be better for us to try and show you some of our stuff to the committee. Actually,
it looks like we're going to have a day doing modelling. We're coming to have a look at your modelling.
Yeah.
I think that would be really helpful.
We can show you all our models. Yeah,
not
but
that
definitely.
kind of modelling.
Yeah.
So, Richard.
Thank you. Secretary of State, auto-enrolment and the National Employment Savings Trust, or NEST. Firstly, really, what's your view on auto-enrolment? And in particular, does it make sense to introduce it while there are still means-tested pensions?
The first thing is that we are, as a coalition, committed factually to the idea of auto-enrolment. So that's written into the face of the agreement, so we will go down that road and make sure we find a way to ensure that it works. We've a review on at the moment, as you know. I can't give you the results of that yet, although they're pretty soon going to be available, I hope. And I won't really break into what the results of those are, but the key issue is, that I can understand the problem of the last government tried to tackle, and I think they were heading in the right direction over this, which is, have some 7 million people who have absolutely no provision whatsoever for their retirement. Recognise, of course, that many of them are on low income, and therefore, putting money into a pension in a long term means, in some senses, them losing some of their spending capacity. So these are issues we have to sort of come to terms with as well while we're looking at it. Part of the review is to look at the way it's delivered, which is why we're reviewing whether NEST is the right device to do it, and we will come forward with our findings on that. And I think, all in all, the only way I can say this to you is I think, by and large, I can't project forward as to what changes we might make or not make within pension provision, but even were the present situation to exist, my answer to your question is yes, I do think that, on balance, it's better to try and encourage as many people to save something towards their retirement, but obviously incumbent on us to look at pension provision from the state standpoint, and that's why I'm enormously pleased that we've relinked pensions to earnings. I know the last government talked about it, and we're going to do it now, and locking in with the triple guarantee, so never less than 2.5%.
On auto-enrolment, I'm sure we all welcome the triple guarantee and the changes made there to state pensions, but just on auto-enrolment, can I ask that the review will really look hard at whether it's going to be compatible with a current system which provides a disincentive to save for the lower paid workers?
Well, clearly, obviously, that is what we have to deal with auto-enrolment, but I can't go much further than that because the review itself is looking at how best it's implemented so that it doesn't damage people's prospects on low earnings, but at the same time does make sure that we keep that process of people on lower earnings actually saving money. So the people that are, I remind you, the three that are on it: Paul Johnson from Frontier Economics, David Yandel, Engineering Employers Federation, Adrian Balding from Legal and General. They are rooted in in the private sector and in business, and so if there's one thing they will be looking at is the balance that you described.
Okay. On Nest, two questions really. Firstly, do you think it's right that government try and design and run savings funds? And if you do, what track record is there, especially in this country, of that being done successfully? And secondly, if you don't think that that's an activity that government should be directly doing and that it should be outsourced to the private sector, how can the department help keep it low cost and above all simple so that the primary target market of the lower paid will actually be able to understand it and benefit from it?
I think the best thing or best way for me to answer that question, given that the review is looking at all of that anyway, is to say that as to use a double negative, is that I don't not think that governments should not be in the arena. So if you can work that out, you're okay. But the reality is, I don't sit here in front of you today with a fixed opinion about that, because that was the whole point of setting up the review, is what I was saying. So whether we have a government-based one or not, there is some good evidence from other countries who have set this up before as process of auto-enrolment, and there are issues. Some argue that only government can do it because the returns are not good enough for companies to do it, but they will also play a part in it. But it needs to be underwritten by government, otherwise the risks are too great. Others argue that, as you just pointed out, that government really isn't good in these areas. So we have to get the balance right, really, as to how we do this. But certainly that's what they're doing when they went out to take this review, and we will look at what they come back with us, and we will make a decision on that basis. So I, again, retain no public view on the matter whatsoever.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I think, unless any of my colleagues have any final questions, we did have questions on child maintenance and health and safety, but we'll leave that for another day. But thank you very much for coming along this morning, and thanks for answering our questions. A lot of these things will continue as we investigate, particularly the youth unemployment areas and housing benefit, and indeed the work programme, obviously as it develops. So thank you again to you, and thanks to my colleagues, and thanks to the Permanent Secretary for coming along.
Pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.